Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering every single person on Earth suddenly has the exact same IQ. No more geniuses. No more dull conversations at family gatherings. Just one universal mental capacity shared by all. Sounds like utopia, or dystopia. Welcome to What If Horizons, where we take impossible scenarios and dissect them until reality begs for mercy. At first glance, this seems like the ultimate equalizer. No more smug debates about who's smarter. No more awkward pauses when someone brings up quantum physics at cocktail parties. But here's the catch. When everyone thinks at the same level, competition doesn't disappear. It just shifts. Suddenly, the guy who used to brag about his Mensa membership is now flexing about his ability to tie cherry stems with his tongue. The academic elite, reduced to arguing over who can name the most varieties of cheese. The workplace would be pure chaos. Your boss can no longer hide behind buzzwords because everyone sees right through them. Meetings devolve into endless loops of, yeah, I was gonna say that, because, well, everyone was gonna say that. Innovation doesn't grind to a halt. It just moves at the speed of the most average idea humanity can collectively muster. And oh, the education system. Standardized tests become glorified participation trophies. Congratulations, you scored exactly the same as everyone else. Here's a gold star that literally means nothing. Ivy League schools. They'd still exist, but admissions would be based on something absurd, like who can balance a spoon on their nose the longest. Now, let's talk entertainment. Imagine watching a movie where every plot twist is equally predictable to every viewer. No more heated debates about whether the ending was clever or cheap. Just universal agreement that yes, we all saw that coming from a mile away. The entire mystery genre collapses overnight. Who needs detectives when everyone solves the crime before the opening credits finish? But here's the real kicker: relationships. Dating apps would have to scrap their algorithms because compatibility is no longer about intellect. Now it's all about who can tolerate your bizarre sock collection or your questionable karaoke choices. Divorce rates might actually drop. Not because people are happier, but because arguments can't escalate when both sides run out of comebacks at the exact same time. And politics. Oh boy, campaign slogans would shift from, "Vote for me, I'm smart," to, "Vote for me, my hair looks slightly less ridiculous than the other guys." Debates would be painful to watch. Not because of the mudslinging, but because every candidate would pause mid-sentence, realizing their opponent was about to make the same point. But here's what's truly terrifying. Without intellectual variation, society would lose its friction. Conflict drives progress. Disagreement fuels innovation. If everyone had the same IQ, humanity might achieve perfect harmony, at the cost of never accomplishing anything interesting ever again. Stay tuned. This thought experiment is just getting started. Now let's examine how science and technology would function in this brave new world of uniform intelligence. Research labs would become eerily efficient yet strangely stagnant places. Picture 100 scientists staring at the same data set, all having identical eureka moments simultaneously. The Nobel Prize Committee would have to resort to drawing names from a hat since every discovery would be made by everyone at once. Medical breakthroughs would follow a peculiar pattern. The entire global medical community would collectively forget about a disease one day, then rediscover the cure the next. Clinical trials would be unnecessary since every researcher would reach the same conclusions independently. Pharmaceutical commercials would still be annoying, just equally annoying to everyone watching. The software industry might actually improve. No more condescending tech support agents pretending your problem is unique when they've heard it 1,000 times before. But coding errors would become pandemic. When one programmer makes a mistake, suddenly the entire world's applications crash in perfect synchronization. The blue screen of death would become a global phenomenon, like some bizarre digital eclipse. Space exploration would take on new dimensions. Mission control would be the most boring place on Earth, with every engineer predicting every potential problem at the same time. Astronauts would report their findings only to hear Houston reply, "We know," before they finish speaking. The first Mars colony would likely fail because everyone had the same brilliant yet fatally flawed design for the oxygen recycler. The tech startup scene would transform completely. Pitch meetings would consist of founders presenting ideas to investors who already know exactly how it ends. Silicon Valley would relocate somewhere cheaper once everyone realized paying premium rent for office space full of people thinking identical thoughts was economically unsound. The term, disruptive technology, would disappear since true disruption requires someone to be, well, more disruptive than others. Consumer technology would stagnate in fascinating ways. Smartphone innovation would peak at whatever level our universal IQ could sustain, then stop. Planned obsolescence would fail as consumers became just as good at predicting failure points as the engineers designing the products. The phrase, next generation, would lose all meaning when everyone knew exactly what that generation would entail. Perhaps most surprisingly, conspiracy theories would flourish like never before. With everyone equally capable of pattern recognition, people would start seeing connections everywhere. The difference is now these theories would spread at lightning speed since no one would be intellectually equipped to debunk them. Flat Earth meetings would have record attendance, not because more people believe it, but because nobody could conclusively prove it wrong to everyone's satisfaction. Scientific journals would face an existential crisis. Peer review becomes redundant when every peer reaches identical conclusions. The publish or perish paradigm collapses when originality becomes mathematically impossible. Academic fraud disappears not because of ethics, but because cheating requires someone to be fooled, and that's off the table now. The technology sector's saving grace might be that while problem-solving ability equalizes, experience and specialization don't. The mechanic who's fixed cars for 30 years still knows more about engines than the theoretical physicist, even if their raw cognitive horsepower now matches perfectly. This slight variation in knowledge might be just enough to keep the wheels of progress turning, albeit at a much slower pace. One unintended consequence: the complete disappearance of tech bro culture. Without the ability to posture about superior intellect, the Silicon Valley elite would have to find new ways to be insufferable. Perhaps through competitive meditation or artisanal water tasting. The horror. Let's explore how the arts would fare in this world of identical intellect. Creativity would become both democratized and strangely limited, like a coloring book where everyone chooses the exact same shades. The first year might produce an explosion of identical novels, each protagonist a thinly veiled author having the same existential crisis. Publishers would resort to selecting manuscripts based on paper quality rather than content. Music would undergo a peculiar transformation. Every composer would independently create the same symphony, leading to endless copyright disputes resolved only when everyone admitted they all plagiarized from each other simultaneously. Concerts would become eerie experiences, with entire audiences predicting every key change and tempo shift. The only remaining music critics would be those stubborn enough to pretend they hear differences nobody else can detect. Visual arts would face an identity crisis. Abstract paintings would lose all mystery when every viewer interpreted them identically. Museums would replace audio guides with simple signs reading, "You already know what this is about." The avant-garde movement would die overnight, as by definition it requires someone to be ahead of the cultural curve, now an impossibility. The film industry would collapse and rebuild in bizarre ways. Screenwriters would turn in identical scripts to every studio, leading producers to greenlight projects based on whose lunch order sounded most interesting. Method acting would disappear since every performer would approach roles with identical techniques. The Oscars would become a lottery system, with winners chosen by drawing names from a golden bowl. Literature would face unprecedented challenges. Bestseller lists would feature hundreds of titles tied for first place. Libraries would need new organizational systems when every reader had identical preferences. The phrase, "This changed my life," would lose meaning when every life changed in precisely the same way after reading the same passage. Stand-up comedy would evolve into performance art. Comedians would deliver punchlines to audiences who already knew the jokes, creating a meta-humor about shared predictability. The only remaining hecklers would be those committed to the bit despite everyone knowing exactly what insult was coming. Comedy clubs would stay in business solely because people still enjoy laughing together, even at jokes they all saw coming. Architecture would reach a peculiar equilibrium. Every city would eventually converge on the same optimal building designs, creating a global monotony broken only by local material availability. Historic preservation efforts would focus on maintaining structures that predated the Great IQ equalization, as the only remaining examples of true architectural diversity. Fashion would stabilize at whatever style our collective intelligence deemed most practical. Seasonal trends would disappear when everyone recognized them as marketing ploys simultaneously. The concept of statement pieces would become literal, with clothing featuring text like, I know, we're all dressing the same. Perhaps most surprisingly, art criticism would transform into a form of social bonding. Reviews would consist less of analysis and more of communal appreciation for shared experiences. The phrase, it speaks to me, would be replaced by, it speaks to us, with all the comfort and existential dread that implies. The silver lining, with everyone equally capable of creation, the distinction between artist and audience might finally blur completely. Every person would become both creator and critic, producer and consumer. The result could be either a renaissance of participatory culture or the most elaborate echo chamber in human history. Jury's still out. Now let's turn to how education would transform in this IQ-leveled world. Classroom dynamics would shift in ways both fascinating and terrifying. Teachers would no longer struggle with differentiated instruction because, well, differentiation just became extinct. The smartest kid in class now thinks exactly like everyone else, including the kid who still eats crayons. Grading systems would collapse overnight. Imagine the existential crisis of teachers realizing all term papers contain the exact same arguments, typos, and questionable citations. Multiple choice tests become an exercise in futility when everyone selects identical wrong answers. Soon schools replace letter grades with participation stickers that say, "Yep, you showed up." Higher education faces an identity crisis. Universities can no longer justify selective admissions when every applicant is equally qualified. Harvard starts accepting students based on their ability to correctly peel a banana with their toes. Academic rivalry evaporates as every researcher publishes identical findings simultaneously. Peer review becomes an empty ritual where everyone politely nods at work they could have written themselves. The textbook industry implodes spectacularly. Publishers discover every professor independently writes the same curriculum. Students revolt when realizing they paid $200 for a book containing knowledge they inherently possess. Soon colleges adopt a single universal textbook titled, What You Already Know but Have to Pretend You Learned Here. Elementary schools undergo strange adaptations. Show and tell becomes an exercise in collective déjà vu as every child brings identical favorite toys. Nap time gets extended because, frankly, the teachers need it more than the kids. Spelling bees end in perfect ties, leaving frustrated organizers to declare winners based on who has the nicest smile. Vocational training becomes the only truly progressive education. When abstract thinking reaches universal parity, society finally values hands-on skills properly. The plumber becomes the most respected person in town by virtue of actually fixing things others can't. Technical schools outperform Ivy League institutions when the measure shifts from what you know to what you can physically accomplish. Parent-teacher conferences take on new meaning. No longer discussions about a child's potential, they become awkward sessions where parents and educators jointly marvel at how average everything is. Gifted programs quietly transition into slightly more enthusiastic about worksheets programs. The most unexpected development. Physical education becomes the most competitive subject. With mental differences erased, athletic ability becomes the new differentiator. The kid who couldn't spell cat but could slam dunk becomes valedictorian. Schools invest heavily in climbing walls while calculus textbooks gather dust in storage closets. Ultimately, education systems might rediscover their original purpose, not sorting students by ability, but cultivating shared knowledge and community values. Though some might mourn the loss of academic excellence, others welcome a world where no child gets left behind because frankly, no child can get ahead either. It's equality achieved through what some might call the ultimate mediocrity. Consider the workplace revolution that would follow universal equal IQ. Office politics would transform into something resembling synchronized swimming, everyone making the same moves at the same time with eerie precision. Job interviews become surreal pantomimes where interviewers already know every answer candidates will give, yet persist in asking anyway just to maintain the illusion of process. Corporate hierarchies would flatten against their will. Middle managers find themselves extraordinarily unemployed when their value as idea translators between leadership and workers evaporates overnight. Meetings that previously lasted hours now wrap in 15 minutes since leadership can't claim privileged insight and workers simultaneously see through all the corporate speak. Someone still brings bagels though. Some traditions survive even radical societal change. Entrepreneurship takes on new dimensions. Every would-be founder arrives at the same brilliant business idea simultaneously, leading to a rash of identical startups that collapse under the weight of perfect competition. Shark Tank episodes become 5-second affairs where investors immediately declare, "We're in," to every pitch before the entrepreneurs finish their first sentence. The resulting companies fail spectacularly when everyone in the organization makes identical leadership errors. The service industry adapts in peculiar ways. Restaurant servers anticipate every customer's order before they speak. Bartenders find themselves making identical cocktail recommendations to entire rooms of patrons. Valet parking attendants now return keys before guests realize they lost them, a small miracle of uniform thought processes applied to everyday problems. Trade professions become society's new elite. When cognitive differences vanish, society suddenly appreciates those rare skills requiring manual dexterity. Electricians and master carpenters form the new aristocracy while former corporate lawyers retrain as furniture makers just to feel useful. The local plumbing union starts charging initiation fees that would make a country club blush. Job satisfaction surveys reveal strange consistencies. Workers across all industries report identical levels of engagement, identical frustrations, and identical coping mechanisms. HR departments struggle to address workplace issues when improvement suggestions arrive in perfectly synchronized waves. The annual office holiday party remains awkward, just predictably so in exactly the same ways for every attendee. Salary negotiations take on a ritualistic quality. Employers and employees arrive at identical fair wage calculations independently, making the entire process a ceremonial dance rather than actual negotiation. Performance bonuses disappear when metrics can't distinguish between workers. Christmas bonuses turn into identical gift baskets containing artisanal almonds and a Starbucks gift card with precisely $12.73 loaded on it. Oddly enough, workplace safety improves dramatically. With everyone anticipating hazards at the same level, accidents become nearly extinct. Safety committees transition into social clubs that still require everyone to wear hard hats during meetings, mostly for nostalgic purposes. The phrase, "That's not my job," disappears from workplace vocabulary when everyone intuitively understands it actually is their job. The silver lining, perhaps finally achieving true workplace meritocracy where no hidden intellectual advantages give certain people unfair leverage. The downside, discovering that equal intelligence doesn't necessarily mean equal work ethic, leaving society to grapple with the uncomfortable realization that motivation separates people more than raw cognitive power ever did. Let's examine how politics and governance would function in this new reality. Election campaigns would become exercises in futility, with candidates delivering identical stump speeches to crowds who already know every talking point. Political debates would resemble awkward mirror dances, where opponents anticipate each other's arguments and counterpoints simultaneously. The only suspense left would be who blinks first. Government bureaucracy would achieve unprecedented efficiency while losing all flexibility. Every civil servant processes forms at exactly the same speed, leading to perfectly predictable wait times. The DMV becomes a model of clockwork precision, though still somehow manages to make everyone equally miserable. Policy discussions reach immediate consensus, not through compromise but because everyone arrives at identical conclusions independently. Lawmaking transforms into a peculiar ritual. Legislators propose identical bills simultaneously, leading to parliamentary procedures that resemble elaborate theater. The concept of political opposition evaporates when both sides share not just goals but thought patterns. Lobbyists find themselves out of work when corporations realize they can't outthink government officials anymore. International relations take on an eerie calm. Diplomats from rival nations keep showing up to negotiations with matching peace proposals. Trade disputes resolve themselves when all parties calculate the same optimal terms. The United Nations transitions into more of a social club, where delegates bond over their shared inability to gain strategic advantages over one another. Local government becomes strangely effective yet uninspired. Town hall meetings wrap up in record time as residents and officials agree instantly on every agenda item. Potholes get fixed before forming because everyone anticipates the problem. Neighborhood watch programs become redundant when criminals and police share equal predictive abilities about crime patterns. The justice system faces an existential crisis. Juries reach verdicts instantly, not through deliberation but because everyone interprets evidence identically. Defense attorneys and prosecutors submit matching arguments word for word. Sentencing becomes perfectly consistent yet somehow feels less fair when accounting for circumstances becomes impossible. Political scandals disappear not because politicians become more ethical, but because everyone anticipates and prevents them with equal foresight. The press struggles to find corruption to expose when wrongdoing gets nipped in the bud universally. Investigative journalists pivot to reporting on the only remaining variable: who has the most stylish ties during press conferences. Political parties either multiply exponentially or vanish completely. With no intellectual differences driving ideology, factions form based on increasingly trivial distinctions. The great political divide might eventually center on whether pineapple belongs on pizza, a debate that somehow becomes more heated when both sides marshal equally compelling arguments. Perhaps most surprisingly, voter turnout reaches 100% not because of civic engagement, but because everyone calculates the optimal voting strategy simultaneously. Election results become perfectly predictable yet remain mandatory, like some bizarre democratic ritual maintained for tradition's sake. The concession speech becomes an art form where losing candidates must pretend to be surprised. Now let's explore how relationships and social dynamics would shift in this equal IQ world. Dating becomes simultaneously easier and more frustrating. First dates lose all mystery when both people can predict exactly how the evening will unfold. The phrase, "you complete me," takes on a literal meaning when partners realize they share identical thought patterns. Breakups become eerily amicable affairs where both parties recite the same reasons for splitting at the same time. Marriage counselors find themselves unemployed as couples now have identical conflict resolution skills. Arguments end in perfect stalemates when neither partner can outmaneuver the other intellectually. The concept of winning an argument disappears from human experience, replaced by mutual nodding and synchronized sighing. Anniversaries become challenging to celebrate when both spouses forget the date simultaneously. Parenting undergoes a strange transformation. Parents no longer pretend to have all the answers because their children now know they don't. Bedtime stories become collaborative storytelling exercises where parents and kids take turns narrating identical plot developments. The phrase, "because I said so," loses all power when children can anticipate the reasoning behind every parental decision. Friendship dynamics reach new levels of harmony and monotony. Friend groups develop perfect consensus on every activity choice, restaurant preference, and conversation topic. The phrase, "I was just about to say that," becomes the most commonly uttered sentence in human history. Inside jokes lose their charm when everyone arrives at the same humorous observation simultaneously. Social media platforms either flourish or collapse under these conditions. Algorithms struggle to curate content when every user engages with posts in identical patterns. Viral trends spread at lightspeed but die equally fast when collective attention shifts in perfect unison. The comments section becomes a sea of identical opinions expressed with slightly different emoji combinations. Family gatherings achieve unprecedented peace and unprecedented boredom. Political arguments evaporate when relatives share identical perspectives. The most heated debate at Thanksgiving dinner might center on whose mashed potato recipe is objectively superior. Everyone uses the same one. Generational gaps disappear when grandparents and grandchildren process cultural changes at the same speed. Social hierarchies flatten dramatically. Popularity becomes impossible to measure when everyone can equally navigate social situations. High school cliques dissolve not through activism but because nobody can maintain in-group superiority. The last remaining social differentiator becomes who can tell the most convincing white lies, a skill that now requires actual effort. Interestingly, loneliness might decrease while meaningful connection becomes more challenging. With everyone operating on the same wavelength, social rejection becomes rare. Yet deep relationships lose some spark when partners can finish each other's sandwiches as well as their sentences. The human craving for both belonging and uniqueness creates a quiet tension in this new social landscape. The world of sports and competition would undergo a surreal transformation with uniform IQs. Professional sports leagues would become exhibitions in perfect anticipation, where every player can predict opponents' moves as easily as breathing. Basketball games devolve into endless tied scores as defenders intercept every pass and block every shot. The only way to score becomes pure luck, leading to bizarre rule changes like blindfolded fourth quarters. Olympic sports face existential dilemmas. Every sprinter runs identical times down to the millisecond, forcing judges to declare ties across entire heats. Gymnastics routines become mirror images of one another, with only minor variations in hairstyle distinguishing competitors. The medals podium would need to be rebuilt as an enormous circular platform to accommodate hundreds of identical gold medalists. Coaching becomes the ultimate exercise in futility. When athletes already know every strategy and counter-strategy, coaches resort to motivational speeches that essentially write themselves. Halftime pep talks consist of players and coaches reciting the same speech in unison before awkwardly realizing they're all on the same page, literally. Spectator sports take on new dimensions. Fans now experience games with perfect predictability, turning stadiums into massive communal meditation spaces. The wave becomes the most intellectually stimulating part of sporting events. Fantasy sports leagues collapse when every team drafts identical rosters with identical results. Youth sports programs transform completely. Participation trophies finally achieve their true purpose when every player actually performs identically. Soccer moms and dads experience unprecedented relief not having to pretend their child is special, though some still do out of muscle memory. The most competitive element becomes the post-game snack rotation schedule. Chess tournaments become performance art pieces. Grandmasters make identical opening moves across every match globally, leading to stalemates by move 6. The chess clock becomes irrelevant when both players take exactly the same amount of time for each decision. The World Chess Championship is decided one year by whose beard looked more distinguished during the final match. Interestingly, extreme sports might see a renaissance. When traditional competition becomes meaningless, thrill seekers turn to activities where the only variable is physical daring. Base jumping becomes popular not for the adrenaline, but because it's the only activity where outcomes aren't perfectly predictable. The X Games unexpectedly becomes the last bastion of genuine sporting excitement. Sports commentary reaches new levels of absurdity. Announcers struggle to fill airtime when every play is anticipated. Broadcasts feature increasingly esoteric discussions about uniform stitching patterns and grass growth rates on fields. The phrase, "anything can happen," disappears from the sports lexicon when exactly one outcome is ever possible. Paradoxically, this might lead to sports being appreciated purely for their aesthetic beauty rather than competitive drama. Fans could learn to savor the artistry of human movement without the pretense of unpredictable outcomes. Or the entire sports industry might implode and be replaced by competitive gardening. At least plants introduce some random variables. Let's examine how healthcare would function in this brave new world of cognitive equality. Doctors' offices would become models of efficiency, with patients self-diagnosing before even sitting down. The waiting room magazine selection would finally improve when everyone agrees on what constitutes quality reading material. Nurses would find themselves handing out identical prescriptions to every third patient, creating bizarre medication surpluses and shortages. Medical school admissions would lose all selectivity. Universities could randomly select applicants from a hat, knowing each would perform identically. The MCAT becomes obsolete when every test taker scores precisely the 50th percentile. Anatomy classes take on an eerie quality as every student makes the same incision errors on cadavers, leading to strangely consistent autopsy findings. Hospitals would operate with uncanny precision. Surgical teams move in perfect sync, anticipating each other's needs before spoken. The downside: entire surgical departments might simultaneously realize they forgot a sponge inside a patient. Medical breakthroughs occur in global waves, with researchers on opposite sides of the world publishing identical findings within minutes of each other. The pharmaceutical industry faces new challenges. Drug trials become redundant when placebo and control groups show identical responses. Pharmacists spend their days filling identical prescriptions for everyone named Michael born in April. The concept of, "ask your doctor if this medication is right for you," becomes meaningless when all doctors give identical recommendations. Mental health care transforms in unexpected ways. Therapists and patients have identical insights at identical times, turning sessions into strange echo chambers. The DSM-50 diagnostic manual shrinks to a pamphlet titled, "We all have the same issues now." Anxiety about being judged disappears, replaced by anxiety about everyone knowing exactly how anxious you are. Dentistry becomes the most competitive medical field. When everyone develops identical dental hygiene habits, cavities become rare. Dentists compete based on who has the most soothing waiting room music or gives out the best toothbrushes. The phrase, "this won't hurt a bit," finally becomes universally true when pain tolerance equalizes across populations. Public health campaigns achieve unprecedented success. Anti-smoking initiatives work perfectly when everyone calculates the same way. Gym memberships skyrocket then plummet as the population collectively decides exercise is important, then collectively decides it's too much effort. Nutritionists agree on the perfect diet, which everyone follows identically for exactly 3 weeks before cheating identically. The most surprising development: healthcare costs stabilize then drop dramatically when unnecessary procedures disappear. But the entire medical billing system collapses when every patient disputes charges with identical, perfectly valid arguments. Insurance companies throw in the towel and start covering everything, realizing they can't outsmart an entire population of equally intelligent consumers. Perhaps the greatest benefit would be the end of health disparities rooted in unequal access to information. But we might discover that equal intelligence doesn't necessarily mean equal health outcomes. Other factors like environment and genetics still play roles, creating new challenges for this supposedly equal society to confront. So where does this thought experiment leave us? A world of uniform intelligence presents both utopian promises and dystopian pitfalls. We'd eliminate intellectual inequality only to discover new forms of differentiation emerging. Society might achieve perfect fairness while losing the creative friction that drives progress. The human experience would become more harmonious yet potentially less vibrant. Perhaps the most valuable insight isn't about how equal IQs would function, but about why we find the concept so compelling, and so terrifying. It forces us to question what truly makes us unique, what drives human achievement, and whether equality means sameness. The real thought experiment might be imagining a world that values all types of intelligence without requiring them to be identical. If this mental journey through possibilities sparked your curiosity, why not continue exploring with us? Share your thoughts in the comments about how you think identical IQs would change society. Which aspects seem appealing, and which sound like nightmares? Don't forget to subscribe to What If Horizons for more mind-bending scenarios that twist reality until it begs for mercy. Hit that like button if you enjoyed this cerebral adventure, and let us know what impossible scenario we should dissect next. Until then, keep questioning the boundaries of possibility.